Welcome to the 6th day of the Leicester Human Rights Arts and Film Festival. We're going to be talking today about Britain's right to protest. My name's Charlotte. I'm going to be chairing the event today. I recently submitted my PhD to Nottingham Trent University, and I looked at the representations of Brexit protests in the national UK daily press, and I'm really interested in how the media are able to manipulate representations of protests to alter the public's perceptions of what is deemed acceptable protest. So that's where my interest lies today. We have four fantastic and very interesting speakers that are going to be talking to us about some of the work that they do. So first up, we have Aderonke Apata, who is a barrister and a human rights activist, and also the founder and CEO of the African Rainbow Family. We also have John Watson from the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers. He's the regional organiser for the Midlands. We also have today Rich Felgate, who's an award-winning documentary filmmaker with a background in climate activism, and he's currently making a new film following climate activist group Just Stop Oil. And last but not least, we have Rachel Currie, who is the organising and partnerships coordinator with NetPol, so Network for Police Monitoring, and also works within the Article 11 Trust, which is a charity working to defend and advance the right to freedom of assembly. So there are four speakers today. We're going to be hearing from them shortly. The way that the event's going to run today is we're going to do a little bit of audience participation first, and then we're going to allow the speakers 10 minutes or so to kind of talk to us about the work they do and to kind of discuss about Britain's right to protest. Just to start us off, I'm really interested if people in the audience would be able to write in the chat, use the chat function to just kind of pop in any comments about any protests that you've been to, any protests that you're aware of or have been affected by, and how you think that Britain should handle protests and demonstrators. So if anybody that's attending today would like to pop that in the chat to kind of get some ideas flowing, some ideas started, that would be fantastic. I'll give people a couple of minutes to do that. So I'll start because no one's written anything yet. So I've been to a couple of climate change protests. They've both been in Leicester, and they have been fairly small scale when I look at, for example, Extinction Rebellion protests or the Just Stop Oil protests that take place in London, and they're a little bit more direct action than marching. The protest I went to first in Leicester, it was before COVID, so a good few years ago now. And then the one I went to most recently was a couple of weeks ago. And I thought it was really interesting that the first protest that I went to was much larger, and we marched through Leicester, whereas the protest I went to the other week was a little bit smaller, and we were just kind of stood at Clock Tower asking for petition signatures and holding placards. And something that I noticed is that police were sent to observers, I suppose. They weren't, I think they were community police officers. So, nothing too, aggressive or invasive. And the community police officers were just asking us kind of what we were doing here and asked to take names of the person organising it. What I thought was quite interesting is that the response from the other protesters were varied. So some protesters were quite willing to chat to the community officers, quite willing to give their names, for example. And there was another protester that was, in particular, was quite adverse to the presence of the community police officers and was suggesting that, why should we have to say why we're here or who's organised it? And he was suggesting that, this is only going to get worse with the introduction of the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, which is just recently passed. So that's where I'm coming from in my experience of protests and my kind of, well, in my personal opinion, I don't think, we should have to tell police community officers why we're there. And I do agree that I think that, policing is only going to get more restrictive and more intense when protests there, even if they are peaceful and even if they are just a few gathered people. So that's where I'm coming from. So we have somebody in the chat, we've got Deborah, and she says that she's looking to build a place where women are more represented in the political sector across the Commonwealth, especially. So Deborah, have you been involved or within that context, have there been any protests that have impacted that or that you have been to around that area?
Not specifically yet, but I am, because I live in the United States. I'm actually from Canada, so I'm just coming here from Canada and living in the United States. I have worked as an intern for the Michigan House of Representatives. So one of the representatives I worked for advocates for women's rights. Her name is Lori Petsky. So that was one of the major issues that we addressed while working with the Michigan House of Representatives. Hello?
Hi, sorry, you're still there. I didn't know if you'd gone up. Okay, great, thank you. So has protest been, has played a particular part of that?
I'm not sure if I've ever gotten involved in a physical, protest as of yet, but, we did get in contact with various citizens and, through phone banking, and, we listened to their, the issues that they had and what needs to be done and things like that. So it was mostly more of a virtual canvassing thing.
Great, cool. Thank you. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. We've also got Claire in the chat who said that she's been on national demos in London and Birmingham to do with climate, banning Trident, freedom for Palestine and things of that nature, including Stop the Arms Fair and with campaign choirs and Quakers. And Claire says she's also been to lots of demonstrations in Leicester with the Red Leicester Choir, supporting UCU strikes, Labour Day, Save NHS, climate marches, Extinction Rebellion, occupying banks on climate issues. So basically everything. That's amazing. Good for you for getting out there and making your voice heard. That's fantastic. And also the cycling campaign to get a bike lane on Walford Road. Fantastic. Claire, can you speak a little bit on how those protests were received? Did you find any instances in which you felt your rights to protest were infringed, or that they were being policed harshly or not policed at all? Could you speak on that?
I don't know that nobody tried to stop us. I think when we occupied the banks, we did some singing anti-fracking carols in Barclays and then in HSBC and one around the corner, Santander. And the staff tried to get us to leave, but they didn't lay hands on us or anything like that. So we just carried on. They had called security on one occasion, but security wasn't really anything they could do, because we weren't stopping people getting into the bank. We weren't committing any offence that we could tell. We were in the bank, like other people were. I don't remember anybody getting particularly irate, but obviously we were making noise, and I'm thinking about for the campaign to get the cycle lane on Welford Road. The council had already blocked off a lane, coned off a lane, and we went and stood in the lane, and there were probably about 50 of us max at any time. And we had big signs up saying honk if you support a cycle lane, and so we were encouraging other people to make noise.
Yeah.
And obviously with Red Leicester and campaign choirs, we make noise.
Yeah.
So that's the particular experience at Stop the Arms fair at Dicey in London a few years ago was a really interesting one, because I sang with a campaign choirs group, and then we were standing between a big truck that had people locked on underneath it that was trying to get into the entrance. And then the Quakers got into a Quaker meeting and sat on the ground, and hundreds of people joined in, and we sat on the ground, and the police came up and said, you know, you're blocking the highway, you're causing an obstruction, you will be arrested if you don't move out in so many minutes. They came around a few times saying that, and people didn't move. And then they brought police officers on horses who were really stern looking women. And they brought the horses right up behind the people on the outside of the circle. There were people from an organisation called the Peace Pledge Union telling the police, you are disrupting an act of worship, that's illegal, you can't do that. So you're breaking your own laws.
Yeah.
And they eventually withdrew the riders, the police on horses. And then they came back on foot and very calmly and quietly just went to each person and said, you will be arrested now if you do not move. And most people moved to one side, but a few people stayed where they were sitting and got carried away and were arrested. So that was the most kind of physical where I've engaged most physically with that, and lots of people were being arrested. But there was also lots of other stuff going on that was great fun and loud and obviously very disruptive, and they've been disruptive for a week leading up to that day. So.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Lots of experience then. That's great to hear. Before we move on, has anybody got any other personal anecdotes that they'd like to share with the protests they've been on or protests they've been affected by? Okay, great. Well, thank you both to Deborah and Claire for your contributions. I think we're now going to turn to the panellists. So as I mentioned earlier, we have 4 panellists that are going to give us some presentations or speak to us about their experiences and about their opinions on Britain's right to protest. So Aderonke, would you be happy to start us off?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's such a scary thing, knowing that the anti-protest bill, it's even been thought of in the UK. Because when I came, and some years back now, I remember all I do mostly is what I refer to as direct protest. And it has always been peaceful. Go everywhere and do all that I need to do to make my point known to either the government or any other government, like, for instance, the government of my country, Nigeria, at the Nigerian High Commission, even up to the Commonwealth office in London. But when that bill came, I got scared, because then I realized that I really would not be able to make my opinion known in this form, because there's nothing wrong in direct protest or any other kind of protest that anybody wants to use or they believe that can work for them. Apart from direct protest, I use other form of campaigning. So, but this one actually baffles me, I must tell you the truth. Because when I was in Yazwood, when I was locked up in Yazwood in 2012, I did lead a protest inside the place. It was a detention center. I led a protest of well over 400 women seeking for our own freedom. And there was no injury to anybody. No property was broken or damaged. Although I was sent to prison as an example for leading that protest. Even though when I was sent to prison, there was no charges against me. They just took me out of the detention center and put me in prison. So from that moment, I think I was a little bit scared, but I wasn't really scared then. I'm talking of 2012. Why I was scared then was because I thought this was a peaceful protest. Why should I be punished and sent to prison? One would probably say because I was locked up in a detention center where I couldn't really exercise much of my rights because of being locked up. But when you now look at you being free everywhere in the community, and then you're now scared of going to the streets to protest. So that's given me a bit of concern. And I'm kind of looking at the limitation that brings to people that are seeking asylum, who actually, their refugee status is precarious, and we are looking at how they're going to have to regularize their stay. So in a way, that's very difficult for me to even mobilize people from African Rainbow Family to say, there's an issue that we want to protest against. Let's go out there and protest. I can do that because that means I'm going to be putting them at arm's length. And I really don't want anybody to have criminal records as a result of protesting, which would flow from my own end when I really know what the implication is. So in a way, what I'm trying to say is it's a form of silencing people not to really come to the streets. And we all know what this has achieved for the UK since people have been protesting. We all know, you know more than I do. I wasn't born here. I only came here about 18 years ago. So for you that are from here, you know the importance of people taking to the streets, showing the way that they feel, and demanding for change. So what this is telling us is we cannot do that anymore. We cannot show how we feel. We cannot ask for change. We cannot say anything. So it's silencing people from challenging the powers that be. So for me, it's a scary thing. Not that I've ever been arrested for protesting. The only time that I was sent to prison was in that instance. But I'm sure if I was in the community, I probably would not be taken to prison. So that was a way of silencing me, repressing me, and then showing to other people in detention center that you cannot protest. So that was actually tested in a way with us, which worked. And then they brought it to everyone now that if you do protest, there's a consequence for that. Yeah, I'm sure John will be able to talk more about protest, coming from your background. And we know how much it works. And Claire's spoken about that. It's just scary. For me, it is scary.
Thank you, Aderonke. I just have a quick question. We're going to do a Q&A towards the end, but if you don't mind, I do just have a really quick question.
Yeah.
So you said that in 2012 this happened when you were in a detention centre and you protested, and then you were taken to prison, obviously not charged, but taken to prison. I was wondering if you thought, would you say that the change, from your opinion, from what you've seen and experienced, has been a gradual change? Do you think it's been implemented slowly and more subtly to the much more stricter restrictions we have now, or do you think it's been quite a quick change?
I think it's been an incremental thing. Towards the end of my opening speech there, I said it was tried with people like me. I was locked up in the Aswood Detention Center. I'm sure a few of you would know about it, about that notorious place.
Yeah.
So if I could lead a protest that was peaceful, no properties damaged, no human being was injured, all we did was to sit in and demand for people's freedom. Because I was there for over a year, being locked up, doing nothing, just waking up and roaming around.
Yeah.
Just like any other woman that was locked up then. just saying, you know, release us back into the community. That's where we belong. If that was all we said, and all they could do was to say, okay, for having that gut as someone that was seeking asylum, to have thought about leading a peaceful demonstration, I was sent to prison. No charges brought about me, against me. So you could see the power, the authority, the control that was exercised over me. So it's been an incremental thing. They got away with it because I could not do anything. I was powerless in the position that I was in. And I'm sure they probably would have done similar things to some other people, even in the community, to quieten them. And since they've been testing the water and they know that they are getting away with it, then it came to the open to say, yeah, we need a law to gag people. So it wasn't like they just came. They don't do anything overnight.
No.
They don't. That's in my experience. They've never done anything overnight. They test it. And this is where I talk about community cohesion. Because if you then look at, okay, that's about asylum, it doesn't really bother me. I've got my stay. You know, I'm okay. I'm not going to be part of it. You're joking, because they have an agenda. They will test it on the very, very most vulnerable people first. And once there's no kickoff, there's nothing, no one is pushing back, then they begin to increase it. Before you know it, it percolates into the community, and that is it.
Yeah. Wow. The way that you term it, as in a sense that it was tested on you first, it was tested on the most vulnerable first, I think is a really, you know, powerful and important thing to remember when we are, you know, talking about these things. Because
sorry to cut in here, because if you look at the UK, if that was done in what they call third country or developing countries, where somebody protested and they were sent to prison, UK will be the first one to say it's an abuse of human rights. What was it about me then? What were they doing? Were they promoting my own human rights at that time? So you could see the hypocrisy, you could see testing of things, and then, sorry to cut in, sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. You're the speaker, you talk.
No, go ahead. I think I want to be quiet a little bit so that other people would have their chance, because I can go on and on about what is wrong with the system, really.
Well, thank you very much. That was very, very interesting, but in a sense, absolutely appalling. And I think it's really important to have those perspectives, because, you know, when we are thinking about the right to protest, generally, it's about, you know, people on the streets and the people that are getting the news and the media attention for like extreme direct action and things of that nature. And I think it's really important not to overlook the protests that are happening in these communities, you know, in detention centres, and that these things don't get reported on. These things aren't, you know, public knowledge particularly. So thank you for bringing that to light, and thank you for sharing your story. Thank you very much, Aderonke. So next we have John. We've got John Watson. So if you'd like to have your 10 minutes.
Lovely, thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm John Watson. I'm the RMT full-time officer for the Midlands, obviously representing a lot of the rail workers, maritime and transport within the UK. But my patch, even though it's the Midlands, I've got members working down as far as London Euston and up in Scotland, including the engineering firms that deal with train maintenance and things like that as well. So that's part of that. And prior to coming into this job, I spent 30 years on the railway working on the front line as a guard. So I've got first-hand experience of the rail industry as well. Just listening to what Aderonke started, and that wasn't part, so obviously I hadn't got any at that point. any idea what she was going to say. She's totally correct with what she says. The government, whichever government it is at that time, if they don't like what somebody's saying, they'll come back with little ways. Well, let's try this. Let's see if we get a kick-off from anybody, whether in that horrible detention centre there, from the general public, any human rights groups, any public support that's out there for an individual. We'll put our spin on it that these protests have taken place, they were illegal, this happened, that happened, even though it's quite often fake, just to try and get their point, to keep people on side and, shall we say, for the want of a better words, towing the line. Well, unfortunately, people, I think, now are starting to wise up to that. We've now got, in the UK, we've always had the right to speak, the right to protest, freedom of speech, allegedly protection under our human rights. Protesting can take various forms and many forms. We've had massive rallies in London with the TUC. The Enough is Enough campaigns over people not being able to afford to heat their houses, having enough to eat, the loss of jobs, to smaller demonstrations over civil liberties. I know people that have been protesting how China's dealing with Hong Kong. Now, to taking strike action and being on a picket line, they're all forms of protesting. Unfortunately, this government wants to be able to take control of all of that and potentially remove our rights to do so. This new police crime sentencing and acts bill that's come into law this year is a potential to change all of those rights. And how far does the bill actually go? And for this government, how does it want to interpret those laws? It might say it's to stop illegal disputes. And in reading through the bill, and sorry if I take some of Rachel's from the pre-conversation that was had, but the government put spin on this, blaming protest groups and how much it costs to police these events. For example, just having a quick look at the legislation the other day while thinking about what I was going to say, the Extinction Rebellion of 2019, the government in its spin, and I put this as spin, saying disruptive and highly dangerous, and also a drain on the public funds. They reckoned there was a £37 million policing bill. It caused disruption to small businesses, transport and commuters, and stopped people getting to work. Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, 172 Met police officers were assaulted. And I'm not condoning violence. And the police do have a very difficult job. But assault is a very broad term when used in legal terms. And again, possible spin from a government hell-bent on restricting our freedom of speech and right to protest. That they admit it was a very small minority. And from the scenes that I saw of the people causing trouble, a lot of them didn't look like Black Lives Matter protesters to me. They looked individuals that had deliberately gone out to cause problems, have a fight with the police, a bit like the football hooligans do on a Saturday, where they've got absolutely no interest of going to the football. They've gone out for a fight and they've arranged it prior to going out. And these were certain individuals that tried to jump on the back of those protests, rightful protests as well, in my opinion. I've seen the police with black friends of mine when we've been out, and we've been to meetings as trade union reps, where the police came over and we were walking back from a meeting, police came over and said that they thought he was causing trouble. He was smart. We were both wearing suits, both carrying bags from where we'd been to a meeting. The police came over and started harassing him. And when I said, well, what are you doing? They said, well, we believe he's done something. Well, you haven't stopped me and we've been together all day, but you're not interested in me. As soon as I asked for the badge numbers and said I'll be putting a complaint into the police, it's like, oh, we might be mistaken. And they suddenly backed off. So I've seen those sort of, the way the police do treat people. So I can understand as well. Individuals will get frustrated. And the police are very good at winding people up and trying to force their opinion potentially on an individual. I've been on the receiving end of that as well as my job when I was a guard on the train. We'd had about 100, on a train prior to me, we'd had about 130 football fans removed for causing trouble on the train. The police wanted rid of them from Leicester, funnily enough, going up to Sheffield. There were Sheffield Wednesday fans going back to Sheffield. It'd been removed because the train in front had refused them because of causing issues. The police had removed them. Oh, we'll put them on the next train. And this police officer threatened me with arrest for refusing to take these football fans because I said I wasn't prepared to take them without police backup, because it's all well and good they're all behaving while the police are there. As soon as they're on their own, then I was stuck with them, and it was me that was going to have to deal with them. And a police officer said, well, if you don't take them, I'm going to arrest you. I said, feel free. And he went, why aren't you bothered? I went, and this was the transport police. I went, no, because you're not the most intelligent of police officers, are you? I can tell you're not a detective. And he went, why are you saying that? I said, well, if you arrest me, not only are you still stuck with 150 football fans, you're stuck with the other 300 people on this train that want to get back to their destination. And he was like, oh. So eventually we came to an understanding that they weren't going to be travelling on my train that night. He said, well, we'll travel now. I was like, no, you had that opportunity and you refused that offer. I said, that request, so you're not travelling. So I've seen myself how certain police officers, not all, there are good police officers out there as well that understand, but I've also seen the bad side of the police as well. And that's from the normal white male. So I can understand how some of those Black Lives Matter protesters were impacted on that. And I'm a big fan of Lewis Hamilton and what he's done as well, one as a Formula One racing driver. Now, when you've got people like that are attending those protests, he's certainly not going to go out there to get himself arrested and to cause trouble. So for the government, yet again, to use those arguments for a very small minority is not, is spin again, in my view. Again, we come up to Insulate Britain protests between the 13th of September and the 20th of November. Nearly 1,000 arrests were made over these protests, and the policing bill cost £4 million. Well, this bill seems more about trying to save a few pounds rather than it does allowing people the genuine right to protest. As a lead officer trade union, I've got these concerns for the transport industry, how this new law is going to impact on my members' right to take strike action. Because as well as having picket lines outside a train station during industrial action, the law could potentially ban us from having protests and taking strike action. As this law says, it's about not stopping people getting to work. Well, us taking strike action does stop people going to work. It also affects businesses when their members of staff can't get to work or spend money in shops. So I can see the government using it on transport workers, say, sorry, you can't picket line out. Have a picket outside your work location going forward. The government, like was said, are very quick to call out regimes like Iran, Syria, Belarus, China, and other dictator regimes for stopping the right to protest and the way they arrest people for highlighting these. Even if it's against the law in that individual country, our government is very quick to call it out for that lack of freedom of speech and along with human rights abuses. But when we do trade with certain countries like China, Russia, and other countries in the Middle East, a lot less is said if it might affect the trade with these countries. A very selective approach, in my opinion. A name that a lot of people will know in this group is Emmeline Pankhurst, who's one of the most famous suffragettes who fought to give women the right to vote. She also started the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903 to start the fight for equality for women. Not all the tactics that group employed were legal, and under the new laws brought in by this government, I'm sure the organisation, if it was started now, would be banned and disbanded, and all of them would be spending in time for prison for the tactics they employed. Especially when you've got Emily Davison, that was fatally injured stepping out in front of the King's Horse at the Epsom Derby. If they just stood outside Parliament giving leaflets out, I'm sure the government at the time would have taken notice of them and taken them seriously and given women the right to vote. And all of those women of the suffragette movement have my utmost respect in what they achieved despite the odds of the time. The suffragette movement is celebrated and talked about in our history in what they achieved, despite them not always following the rules of law. I can't see with this bill that they would be getting the same respect that they've got in British history now. The groups of highlighting major change issues of today, like climate change, equality and equal rights, and the greed from big businesses and the things that this government don't want to hear about with the new laws will no longer have the right to protest and force change, because we've got a government that doesn't want to listen or act on these important changes within our own country and across the world, because it doesn't suit their narrative. Everyone here this evening will have a different opinion on the protests and tactics that have been taken place with Extinction Rebellion and others. But in the UK, it's our right to protest and to have our freedom of speech. And again, this all comes back to a government that doesn't want to listen or act on these major issues affecting the country and the world. It's not what this government wants to hear. The bill states that it will be the police that will decide on the protests, but it's a Home Secretary who controls the police and gives them their orders. And I'm sure if it's a protest she doesn't want, she'll say, ban that. You can guarantee it, because it's not something this government wants to hear. And it'll soon be banned. Once a protest is stopped, banned, or individuals are arrested and charged, it silences the protests and everything goes quiet until a court case, and it suddenly appears then in the media, but it decides on innocence or guilt, and the ban is challenged legally. But by then, what regards to protest, it's over. It's too late for people to have their voices heard. With this law, we potentially take another step down, losing those rights that our predecessors fought so hard to obtain. We need to fight like hell to keep them now, rather than allow this government to take us back to times when people had no rights or freedoms. They almost want to take us back to the Victorian times, where the government and the big bosses had every single right. Employees and the public have absolutely no right. I think this bill has been brought in stealthily, on the quiet, without all the facts, so they could get it through without anybody potentially protesting and objecting to it. This government just seems to roll from one disaster to the next. And by doing so and trying to blame the protests, strike action, rallies, they're trying to use that as an excuse for all the issues in this country rather than addressing them. And they listen to their friends, which are a very small minority of people that donate to their party, or their friends in big business that are then trying to bankroll them, rather than the public that they're supposed to represent and protect. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was fantastic. A really interesting exploration of the bill and the implications it could have. I think a really good point when you said, when you were talking about the suffragettes and you said how they succeeded despite the odds of the time. I wonder I hope at least in maybe even 10 or 20 years time, we can look at, groups like Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and think, thank God that they succeeded despite the odds at the time. I really hope that that's something that we'll be able to say in the Leicester Human Rights Arts and Film Festival 2045 or whatever it might be. But yeah, thank you so much, John. That was fantastic. So next we've got Rich. So Rich, if you'd like to take the floor.
Hi, everyone. So thanks for having me here. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I guess, specialize in filming climate protests. So I made a feature documentary called Finite, which follows communities resisting against the fossil fuel industry, kind of on the front line, trying to stop open cast coal extraction. And then more recently, I've been following Just Stop Oil. So I've kind of been on the ground for a lot of the protests, and kind of seen the police response firsthand, and the hearing and documenting all about the motivations of the protesters and their tactics. But then also I've kind of inadvertently been caught up in the policing response, let's say, to the protests. And whilst filming, I've been arrested twice. Most recently was when the protests on the M25 happened, where I was filming from a public footbridge with alongside another press photographer, and kind of instantly when police came on the scene, they came up to us and just put handcuffs on us straight away. And that was following on from a couple of weeks before, where I filmed some of the quite high profile protests that got a lot of coverage in the media, like the kind of infamous soup protest on the Van Gogh painting. The day after that, I kind of got accused of helping the protesters and got arrested, and both times I got released with no further action. And I think it's I feel like my experience is kind of part of this wider repression of protest, but also has a few kind of unique it tells us a few unique things about what's happening with the new policing powers. And when I was arrested on the M25 alongside 3 other journalists, we were all arrested for conspiracy to commit public nuisance. And this is kind of the I'm sure Rachel will be able to go into it in more eloquent detail, but this is the kind of notoriously vague, abstract offence, which is kind of could be a bit of a catch-all, and definitely adding the conspiracy element to that. They managed to arrest me for being near a protest that was happening, and obviously being a filmmaker, having the kind of tip off of where to be in order to document it. That they're seeing that as some kind of conspiracy. So I think that's a really kind of chilling like precedent that's being set, and a potential for people to be, for these laws to be kind of misused, misunderstood by the police, and abused essentially. But I also think the kind of pattern of journalists being arrested shows this very clear hostility of the government towards a light being shone on not only the protests, the Just Stop Oil protests, but the issue itself. Because I think often these protests are very much depoliticized in the media. When we see coverage of protests in other countries, like what's happened in China recently or in Iran, we don't hear about the traffic jams in Beijing or Shanghai. We hear exact first thing is why people are protesting. And when it's a foreign government, particularly maybe where there's hostilities between 2 countries, a light is shone on the issue. There's criticism towards the government. But in our country, I think a lot of the time the media is almost protecting the status quo by focusing on the disruption and delegitimizing the political reasons for the protests. So I think perhaps there is maybe a fear that when protests like Just Stop Oil, they really do capture kind of the attention of the world, there is they almost can't keep the genie in the bottle about, you know, what the crisis that they're protesting about, you know, the future of whether civilization survives, whether we survive, whether our loved ones survive, whether people, you know, in the most impacted countries right now survive. It's like that's what we should all be talking about. That's what needs to be on the news every day, and it isn't. So I think, yeah, well, what we're seeing with the policing bill is all part of that context of keeping the machine going and kind of keeping us all just enough distracted or just enough outraged by disruption in order to stay relatively quiet. Yeah, and I think another, where I mentioned about my experience being part of this wider repression we're seeing at the moment. This year, there's been over 100 climate protesters imprisoned, and right now I think there's 20 something, maybe a third, 30 people in prison. A few of them, these are mostly Just Stop Oil protesters. A few of them have been on remand for a really considerable amount of time, like 5 or 6 months at this point now, and are expecting to be in prison and awaiting trial sometime next year. Yet we are really not hearing much about this in the news. Again, if it was in another country, peaceful, non-violent protesters being imprisoned in massive numbers would be, you know, we'd be hearing about it. And I think where it's the recent policing bill has obviously given the powers to be able to do this. I think where we're seeing kind of the recent rhetoric of Rishi Sunak wanting to clamp down on the most recent Just Stop Oil protests and pushing for this public order bill. What I see in the media is this kind of creation of a narrative that the Just Stop Oil protesters are getting away with it. They're causing all this disruption and they're not even getting arrested. And poor police don't have these powers to do everything. They need to get more powers. And, you know, at the same time, I think, you know, most of the people that protested in the M25 are in prison. They kind of, what are they going to do? You know, do they want the police to start beating them? Like, is that the kind of political points they want to score to, really create this war on protesters essentially? And I think that's often over. Maybe it legitimizes public support for more police powers when the general public aren't really hearing that police are using the existing powers, and that's no mistake as far as I'm concerned. And just kind of touching again on the disruption, I think we're seeing so many kind of parallels in strikes happening at the moment that it's always the disruption is that's the lead story on reports to do with the strikes. The same with the disruption caused by protests is the lead, not the issue. And it's manufacturing this consent to clamp down on strikes and on protests, because similarly to new policing powers, we're hearing about potential for new repression of strikes, making it difficult for certain sectors to go out on strike. I think we see so much hypocrisy both in the media, in the government criticizing the repression of the press in other countries, but then doing the same thing here, repression of protesters in other countries, but then doing the same thing here. So it's really kind of, yeah, constructing a counter narrative to the proposals for the public order bill, and in just, you know, what's happening with protests at the moment is really important, because we're not getting the truth in the mainstream media. Yeah, I think I'm finished there, really. We can come back to more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Rich. That was fantastic. Very interesting. I think I personally am really interested in how the media represent protests as well. And I think what you said about that you were arrested under the conspiracy to protest, and how the word conspiracy is a very hostile term to use, and, you know, as well as vague, a very hostile term to use. And I think, you know, as you were saying about like this attempt to manufacture consent through the media, and like having this effect on the way that we perceive protests, it almost moves the protest, even though people are being arrested for peaceful protests, it kind of moves the action of actual protest or attending a protest from the realm of democratic to kind of the realm of the criminal, which is what I kind of took from what you were saying about conspiracy, and, you know, like the legitimization of the consent against not being able to protest. So thank you. I thought that was very, very interesting and raised some really great points. So thank you, Rich. So last but not least, we've got Rachel. So if you'd like to take the floor.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I had a specific talk written down, and then everyone's made such good points. I've got so many things I want to talk about now. But yeah, thank you, everyone. That was actually extremely interesting. And John, your mention about Spin, I shared a link in the chat about Kings North, which is a climate protest. They released into the media that there was 70 police injuries. Turned out none of those injuries were actually from protesters after a Freedom of Information request by the Liberal Democrats. That's an example that we see in our work on a regular basis, and I'm sure you're used to this, Rich, as well, like media reporting as though protesters have been violent, or they're criminals, or, you know, the negative kind of spin on it, and the talk of disruption, and the talk of what if an ambulance can't get through, and, you know, framing things as a threat and as a danger, rather than talking about the issues that need to be talked about. And the same with industrial action. Yeah, there's so many points I want to add, but okay, I'll move forward. I'll get my bits done, and if I've got any time, I'll talk about the other bits at the end. Yeah, so I'll start up on the current context. So Rich said there's been 100 climate activists in prison this year. At the moment, as far as we know, there's currently at least 50 people behind bars as a result of there's Just Stop Oil, there's HS2 injunctions, there's Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and the Kill the Bill protests in Bristol. And while this number is a mix of people sentenced and also on remand, the majority of environmental protesters, as Rich said, are on remand. And this includes the academic Jan Goody, who was recently sentenced to 6 months and will be spending Christmas in prison. And a group of academics have prepared a solidarity statement. I'll send a bunch of links at the end. So Jan is not the only political prisoner in the UK, but he is the first person to be prosecuted under the new statutory offence of causing a public nuisance, which was enshrined in law by the draconian PCSC Act, which passed through Parliament this year. And on the 11th of November, 3 people were sentenced for their participation in the Bristol uprisings against this act on the 21st of March 21. While many cases from the Kill the Bill uprisings are still awaiting sentencing or are going through the courts, at least 15 people so far have been convicted of riot and sentenced in total to over 75 years in prison. And again, I'll share a link at the end if you want to read the story of one of the people that have been sent to prison. They've got significant sentences. And actually, something that did come to mind as well when I can't remember who was speaking, there's the BLM protest. There's someone a young man who's been sent to 2 years in prison for a BLM protest for throwing a bottle. So he got arrested for violent disorder for throwing a bottle. But we're seeing around protests, we're seeing increasingly long, harsh sentences and harsh crimes as well, because there's a decision made at the point of arrest and charge for what crime is that person is going to be assigned as having committed. So it will be the reframing of violent disorder or riot instead of other offences. And that is obviously a decision that's being made by the police and the CPS. So despite the huge opposition to the PCSE Act in 2021, it became law in summer this year, and there's a lot of confusion about what changes the Act made and the impact that actually does have on our right to protest. And we know that the government's justification of the Act, using this rhetoric of protest becoming more disruptive and needing new laws to deal with what we're describing as new tactics, is just wrong, because tactics such as like disrupting print works, blocking roads, locking on, have been used for decades and in some cases centuries. But this is again a narrative shift. We're saying, oh, these protesters are getting worse, they're being more disruptive, so we need better laws to criminalise them further. So I'll give a brief overview of the powers, and I'll also link in a more detailed explainer as well. So the first one to talk about is noise conditions, and I think that was probably the most well-known one and the one that most people were concerned about. As far as we're aware, we haven't actually seen it be applied yet, but we kind of class this as part of the shopping list of powers, of new powers that the police haven't worked out how to use yet, but the government is implementing in the case that a situation arises that they would like to criminalise. And it's important to stress that in England and Wales, police have had the ability to impose conditions on protests since the 30s, and particularly the Public Order Act in 1986. So Section 12 for marches, Section 14 for static protests, they already gave police commanders huge discretionary powers and were used arbitrarily and often unlawfully. The PCSE Act strengthens this ability to impose conditions where there's a risk that the noise will cause serious disruption, which is obviously an extremely subjective term, and creates a situation where far more protests, far more often, are likely to face the prospect of having conditions imposed on them. We know from experience that the police are already quick to impose restrictions and conditions on protests, which is why any organisation that's likely to make its voice heard noisily should feel alarmed by these changes. Every effective environmental protest over the last 2 decades, from local opposition to fracking sites, open cast coal mining or airport expansion, has caused disruption to corporate interests. And the Act gives police far greater powers to impose restrictions on these kind of political movements in the future. And that kind of issue of corporate interests is something that we see again and again, and actually something I'll touch on at the end with the new term aggravated activism, because even law activism, which means that you can be subject to police surveillance, you can be referred to counter-terrorism police, and the police will potentially can disrupt protest activity that is lawful if it significantly impacts UK businesses. And this is a new term, and it obviously keeps getting worse, but don't lose hope. We can resist this. The next new condition is the ought to have known conditions on protests. So previously, the Public Order Act 1986 said a protester may face arrest if they knowingly fail to comply with the condition. The PCSE Act amends this so that it's an offence if a person who knows or ought to have known that the condition has been imposed. So previously, the prosecution had to prove that defendant knowingly failed to comply. Now the obligation lies on the defendant to show that why they could not have known. So that shifts the burden of proof there from police having to prove a defendant's guilt to a defendant having to prove that they're innocent, which is obviously quite a shocking precedent. The next one is intentionally or recklessly causing a public nuisance, and that was what Jan Goody was sentenced to prison for. The PCSE Act abolishes the current common law offence of public nuisance and creates a new statutory offence of causing serious distress, serious annoyance, serious inconvenience, or serious loss of amenity. And public nuisance has been ripe for reform for many years. It covers not only demonstrations, but a range of situations such as factory pollution, sewage leaks into rivers, But the government sent a really clear signal in this legislation, about who it expects to face these charges by choosing to include this in the section of legislation concerned with public order and protests. So it's not clear what the new terms will mean for protesters. And again, it's quite vague and subjective language. But serious loss of immunity does seem to indicate that protests outside of a company, or including direct action or industrial action, that result in it losing business, are more likely to tempt the police into greater use of public nuisance charges. A new statutory offence would result in a maximum sentence, if tried in magistrates' court, of 6 months in prison or a fine, or both. And for more serious cases in a Crown Court, up to 10 years in prison. The next one is obstruction of the highway. This is probably one, Rich, that you will be familiar with. JSO obviously do this often, and I was on an action 1st of October. Some of the Netpol team came out to support JSO and to observe the policing of that action, and that involved blocking the bridges in London. So the PCSE Act amended Section 137 of the Highways Act 1980 to increase the maximum penalty for obstruction of the highway from a fine to up to 6 months imprisonment. And this also is not, this point that's not being talked about as much, is it means it's more likely for people to face tough pre-charge bail conditions. It's a provision in the Act that encourages a reduction by custody officers in the use of release under investigation, which is RUI, and a return to applying pre-charge bail conditions for a period of up to 3 months. So we at Netpol have always opposed the use of pre-charge or police bail for protest arrests, because the low threshold for setting conditions and their discretionary nature are an invitation to abuse. And police bail can be used as a way to restrict legitimate protests, particularly involving individuals belonging to or associated with groups critical of the state or corporate interests. And the conditions are poorly defined and often seem designed to guarantee that they're breached. Some examples include Londoners being prohibited under pre-charge bail conditions from entering central London with no specific geographical guidance, or restriction on freedom of movement, either based on residency conditions or exclusion zones, including entry to specific areas or boroughs associated with ongoing protests. So this makes it very hard to comply, and our worry is that we will see a return to these kind of restrictions for things as simple as blocking a road, which is a peaceful protest. And such conditions can be challenged before a court, but the process of challenging these in court can be costly and time-consuming. The final one is new offences around Parliament. The Act extends the controlled area around Parliament where particular laws apply, adds a new offence of obstructing passage of vehicle in or out of any entrance or exit from the Palace of Westminster controlled area. So this seems particularly aimed at locking the road around Parliament Square and up as far as the Cenotaph. So why does this matter? The vague terminology in the Act and the confusion about what these new powers mean is intended to frighten people into self-policing and staying at home for fear of being criminalised for legitimate protest. And so it's less about tackling disruption, which is the language that is used, and it's more about intimidating people into not joining protest movements that the police recognise are likely to grow. And one of the more important aspects of choosing to exercise our rights to freedom of assembly, expression and association is certainty. So if we know how the police and the state will react to our protest and what will happen to us, that's a factor in whether many people feel like they can participate in exercising their rights. And the uncertainty makes it harder for people to exercise their rights. So we have a list of ways that we suggest that we can challenge this uncertainty. So the first one is obvious, is know your rights. So everyone needs to know their rights, and it's important especially to have legal observers present to monitor policing of protests and demonstrations. Because of the changes in law, we can't guarantee that a protest we might have thought wouldn't have a police presence or wouldn't involve arrests, it might now have arrests and it might involve police presence. So we would always recommend, if you're planning a demonstration or you're going to participate in one, go and have a look on the Green and Black Cross website. You can read their detailed guide on the Act, or you can book on free trainings. You can also get in touch with them if you would like a legal observer for your demonstration. The next point is to resist police surveillance. So as I talked about with the aggravated activism issue, we're seeing increasingly people being categorized as aggravated activists, and we're also seeing an increase in police surveillance. So new powers aren't the only way of intimidating people. We're also seeing a significant growth in police surveillance. And this label, aggravated activism, justifies intelligence gathering on groups associated with unlawful behaviour or criminality, or that cause an adverse economic impact to businesses. So this is aimed squarely at protecting corporate and business interests, obviously against challenges from campaigners, but we need to resist this kind of surveillance. So we need better protection for the members of our movements that are more likely to face such targeting. So that means the people that the police are likely to identify as organisers, or who are otherwise marginalised and likely to experience increased use of force or surveillance from the police. And a greater awareness of basic security practices, which can help us to challenge intelligence gathering. So this, for example, and it was a good point that you mentioned, Charlotte, about people having attitudes to police at demos, was we recommend never talking to police liaison officers. They wear the blue bibs and they're very well trained, and their job is to gather intelligence. And so you might be having a friendly chat with them, but what you might not know is that they're getting information about someone else that could then be used to criminalize someone else, or it could be used to implicate you in a crime that you didn't think that you were committing. So we would say never talk to the PLOs as a general practice. So it means also, sorry, I'm getting a sign saying my internet isn't very good, but hopefully everyone can still hear me. It means also knowing that the police gather most of their intelligence from public available means, so especially social media. Never live stream demonstrations, because what the police do is they spend a lot of time taking all the information off of your social media, and then they can use it to arrest or criminalize other campaigners or feed their intelligence that can increase their surveillance. We also want to talk about collective solidarity. So we need to get better at not seeing ourselves as in isolation from other campaigns, and that the threat of oppressive protest policing falls on all of us. So we really need to start offering solidarity to each other, which means actively rejecting any effort to divide us into good or bad protesters, and not publicly condemning other people's tactics. So that might mean if you disagree with JSO, or if you disagree with Palestine Action, we don't need to publicly condemn each other's tactics, because we're all taking different tactics to move towards justice and the important issues that we need to deal with. And finally, we encourage people to help us to monitor the police. So Netpol needs your help. We need to know when new powers are being used and in what circumstances, so that we can continue to effectively monitor and campaign against repressive protest policing. And that includes labour unions and renters unions, which are increasingly being targeted by police. So we've got an encrypted monitoring form. I'll send all the links in the bio. Now I'll just pop this in the chat, and hopefully that's sorry, there's quite a lot there. Yeah, and hopefully that's it. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry that was a lot of information.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for this. This will be we'll be going to bed quite late tonight by the time we've got through all of these links, I think. Thank you. Thank you so much for being so clear and so informative about what rights we actually do have now. I think I've seen so much, and also myself, I've read a lot about, the police crime and sentencing bill and what it is, and as you say, the very vague things about, we're not allowed to make noise to a certain extent, but no one really knows what that means, and it's not even particularly policed yet, as you said. So thank you so much for telling us actually what rights we do have, because I've not really seen much discourse around that in the public sphere or like non-specialist spheres. So thank you so much for bringing that to the table. So we've got 15 minutes until the end of the event. I think if we could have like a 10-minute Q&A, that'd be fantastic, and then we'll just have a couple of minutes at the end for our speakers to make some final comments. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you want to type them in the chat, I can speak on your behalf, whatever you feel comfortable with as audience members. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. I've got one to kick us off, if that's all right. So, Rachel, you were saying about one of the things that the police that are coming to the protests are doing now is to gather intelligence. So we've got like this idea from Rich about being arrested for like conspiracy, and we've got this thing of like gathering intelligence, and all of the language that's kind of being used around this bill is so, it almost feels like a kind of like a spy film when they're trying to stop terrorist groups. Do you know what I mean? There's all this language that seems really militarized and really draconian, as you said. So I don't know, well, that's not really a question really, it's more of an observation, but do you think this is more a specific thing that is being used, you know, when these policies are being written to, does it kind of, from the police perspective, from Netpol's perspective, does that kind of prime the police to behave in a particular way? Is that priming them to be more aggressive, to be more militant? If we have the kind of discourses around the language that's used that is also seen in other areas of policing that are more serious?
Yeah, I definitely think that the narrative and the government's framing and the media representation is certainly either changing police's opinions or emboldening the police to take further actions, arrest first, and then decide which power and which, you know, arrest first, ask questions later, because every single officer obviously is a human being, and so they're going to be reading the media, they're going to be seeing what people are saying online, and they're going to be thinking, oh, well, the general public doesn't agree with protest, or the general public is finding this disruptive and annoying. And so it's less about what is legally allowed or what is your human right, and it's more about, I'm going to behave in a way that I think, you know, fits with my opinions. And we definitely do see a difference in policing of groups based on certain prejudices, or certain protest groups being policed much more harshly. Like we published some research into the policing of Black Lives Matter protests that found that there was a significant discrepancy in the way that black and brown protesters were treated by police. And that's something that we expect, is that opinions and prejudices are influenced by the world around us, and that is then enacted on people on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. We have from Maria in the chat as well. That was brilliant, Rachel. I've saved all these links. This is such brilliant advice. I'll pass it on to student rebellion occupiers at my university. Thank you. Do we have any more questions for the speakers? I have another one, if that's okay. It's a bit more media-y, because that's obviously where my interest lies, for Rich. I was wondering, from your opinion of your kind of like involvement in like the journalism side of things and the tracking side of things, the kind of extent to which you personally think, being on that side of the, you know, the reporting and the coverage, that the mainstream representations of protests impact the people working in the police, or impact the perceptions that the powers that be have against protesters?
So I mean, with regards to the police, I think it almost doesn't matter how it impacts them personally, how they see the how the press coverage impacts them, what their opinion is, because at the end of the day, when they put on the uniform, they have to follow their orders.
Yeah.
And like that, you know, that's what I think is the main kind of takeaway from the police reaction. And that's, you know, I think that's how these laws are enforced. I'm sure there's police that don't feel comfortable arresting, you know, like people's grands that are sat on the road trying to protect their grandchildren's future. Like that's probably not what they signed up for, but this is how the status quo is enforced.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
When I was at the protest I spoke about very briefly at the start of the event, and we had the like the community police support people come and ask us, why we were there and what we were doing, that one of the protesters said, why are you here? Why are you asking us these things? And they literally said, we're just doing our job. We don't really know why. We've been told to come and check it out, so we've just come to check it out. Again, whether that was a strategy just to gain information, as Rachel was saying, because they, but whether they wanted to be there or not, as you say, it isn't really their choice at the end of the day, is it? That's just the way that policing's going, and they have a job to do.
Mm-hmm.
So before we ask for closing comments from our panelists, I'm just I don't think anybody else has got any questions. Nothing's coming through in the chat, but please do feel free to write something if you have it. But I would just like to ask all of our speakers just for 1 or 2 minutes for just some concluding remarks. So starting with Aderonke.
Thank you for all of the information that everyone has shared today. I just want to say something which I touched on, and if not all of the speakers actually touched on it, in different ways, which is solidarity. Because that's the only way that we can win. If we think it's not affecting me, so I'm not bothered, I just want to remind you, and probably remind the next person to you, that it could be your turn tomorrow, and you're going to need someone to stand by you. It's like me preaching to the converted here. You all know this principle, but I would want us to please continue to drum this to other people who probably are quite ignorant of it, or they know, but they really don't care. Because there are so many reasons why some people behave in the way that they behave. Sometimes we might not be able to explain all those reasons for them. So I think that solidarity is quite important. Like the strikes that are going on by rail workers, I said, yeah, I'm a rail worker, although I'm not employed there, but I feel their pain because I believe there is something that they want. If it's not a reasonable thing, they would not be talking to the government and taking all the actions that they need to take. Therefore, I want to see when I want to do similar thing, or I am in a similar position, I should be able to find a way of protesting if they don't want us to come to the street anymore. They say the level of noise that you can make. Please tell me, how can you gauge the level of noise? Who tells us that level? So it's all, to me, organized chaos and a way of wanting to make us go out there and say, don't shout, but they will still come and arrest people because there's a level of noise that you can make. And nobody's told us that level and how we measure it. I'm not saying that people should not go out there to do it if they feel it is safe for them. I think, Rachel, you've shared a few things here today that people can use as tips. So let us all look at all this and also say to our friends and families who want to protest, who want to go to the streets, and say, be careful, have these tips with you. And I'm sure there are some solicitors who always give us a few numbers that we can call when people have been detained or are arrested. I don't have those numbers, but I'm sure they can be shared, maybe with time to give to people to have it handy. Otherwise, they don't want us to talk. And I think we need to speak out because everything that they do affects us. So thank you, everyone. I've enjoyed this conversation. And yeah, I hope we take it forward from here again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. John, do you have any concluding remarks?
Just a couple. I think to start with, Aderonke, I think, summed everything up brilliantly. And I couldn't disagree with what she's just said at all. Solidarity, togetherness, moving forward together, sticking together is the only way we'll potentially change any of this bill, which is what we're talking about tonight, and move things forward in the right direction over lots of other things, because there's lots of things out there that need to change, not just this bill. We've got the climate emergency that we're currently in that just gets bigger and bigger by the day. That this government and every other government will do the talking, but we're not going to back it up with any actions. That seems to be ongoing. And the only way we can do it is everybody together, showing what it means when everybody's there together, showing that support. Because I once, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but it was once, yeah, while it doesn't affect me, I stick my head in the sand. And then when it gets round to you, potentially, who's going to support you? Because you're the last one standing, because they've picked everyone off one by one until they get to the last person. Then there is nobody left to fight, and they've won. So by everybody, whether it affects you or not, in a roundabout way, yes, it does affect you, and eventually it's going to affect you. So being there and showing support when it doesn't affect you protects yourself at the end of the day. And that's what we need, solidarity and togetherness. And that's it from me.
Thanks so much, John. Rich, any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I think it's I guess I'd just like to say, I think these laws are coming in because the tactics are effective. It's kind of validation that these tactics make a difference. And I guess it's, for making change, there's going to be confrontation. It's inevitable. This is part of the process, and it's into a new, more dangerous, more repressive chapter. But protesters are no longer being ignored. Now they're being fought, and I think they're kind of, these laws are brought in because there's this massive fear of, hang on, what if Just Stop Oil was more than 500 people? What if 5,000, 50,000, 1 million people did this? Then, game over. They've lost. And we see how a wedge is driven to make sure that these protest movements stay relatively small. A wedge is driven between them and everyone else, that somehow climate activists aren't ordinary working members of the public, or that striking workers aren't hardworking families. And we all need to be in solidarity.
Thank you so much. And Rachel, finally, any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I think everyone's points are really amazing, and I'm really glad to end this on that note, because there's so much fear, and there's so much uncertainty, and there's so much negativity. So yeah, I guess that what I would add is that while all of these laws, the Public Order Bill, the Nationality and Security Bill, the PCSC Act, they're unprecedented, and they are concerning, and they are serious. But I want to emphasize that protest is still not illegal, and that your Article 11 rights are still enshrined in international domestic human rights law. So we're already seeing a chilling effect of these legislations and the narratives, where people are feeling too afraid to go out and take to the streets or to get active. So reiterate, challenge that by knowing your rights, going to the trainings, sharing that information with other people, and also continuing to exercise those rights, because protest is perennial. People have been making themselves heard in the worst situations for centuries, and dissent is creative. It's always going to exist, and it gets results. Protest and unionization has earned us the weekend, the right to vote, and end to child labor. Like, keep going out there, keep fighting. And I know that there's, it's difficult, but it's good to end on a positive note.
It certainly is. Thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of our event. It's now 7:30. So I'd just like to thank the speakers once again for really, really informative, really interesting discussion, and also discussions from different perspectives as well. We've not only spoken about, major climate change protests, we've also been talking about protests that have happened in detention centres, and these protests that don't get the coverage as well. So I think it's really important that we've had these conversations that shed light on, all of the different perspectives. So thank you so much. So the links that Rachel's shared in the chat, just to draw everybody's attention to those, I'm going to circulate those in my networks as well. Thank you so much. So we have the final event of the Leicester Human Rights Arts and Film Festival tomorrow. It's What's Next for African Students in Ukraine. It's another online panel event, and you'll be able to find registration links on our Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. So thank you all so much. Thank you for the participants and the attendees and all the questions. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Charlotte, for hosting.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so
Bye.
much.